The air over the stagnant pond was thick with the smell of decay. It was the scent of trapped time, of still water and rotting leaves that had settled for decades into a dark, silty brew. The chugging rhythm of the gasoline-powered pump was the only thing that broke the oppressive silence of the 10-acre property Elias Thorne had bought for that very quiet. For 3 days, the pump had been his only companion, tirelessly pulling the lifeblood from the murky depression in the earth. Beside him, Ghost was uncharacteristically agitated. The German shepherd, usually as stoic as Elias himself, paced the muddy perimeter. His head was low, his black-tipped ears twitching. A low whine, a sound reserved for distant thunder or the unsettling scent of a predator, rumbled deep in his chest. Ghost's amber eyes were fixed not on the shrinking waterline, but on a particular patch of earth that was beginning to emerge from the black water. It looked no different from the rest of the sludge-caked bottom. Elias watched the dog. A retired Marine gunnery sergeant, Elias had learned to read signs others missed. He'd spent 20 years honing his senses to detect the subtle shifts in an environment that signaled danger. He trusted his gut, but he trusted Ghost's instincts more. The dog had been astray, scarred and wary, but a quiet understanding had formed between them, an unspoken pact built on mutual respect. "Easy, boy," Elias said, his voice a low gravel that didn't carry far. Ghost ignored him. His focus was absolute. As the last of the water receded, leaving behind a glistening expanse of black mud littered with the ghosts of discarded things, a rusted tire rim, a shattered bottle, the skeletal frame of a bicycle, Ghost trotted down the slick bank. He stopped at the spot, the very one he'd been staring at for hours. He lowered his nose to the mud, sniffed once, then twice. He looked back at Elias, a clear and urgent command in his eyes. Then he began to dig. Pause sent sprays of thick, foul-smelling mud flying. He dug with a frantic energy that was entirely alien to his normally composed demeanor. Elias had bought this property on the outskirts of a forgotten North Carolina town to be left alone. He had a simple plan: fix the derelict farmhouse, clear the land, and drain this eyesore of a pond. He wanted to impose order on a place that had long been surrendered to neglect. Now, his dog was imposing a new, unexpected mission. "Ghost, leave it." The dog paused, panting, mud splattered across his muzzle. He barked once, a sharp, percussive sound that echoed in the empty basin. It was not a request. It was a summons. Elias let out a long breath, the cool autumn air doing little to cut through the stench of the disturbed pond bed. He'd seen that look in the dog's eyes before, on a hiking trail once, moments before a copperhead had struck at the empty space where Elias's boot had been. He didn't question it then, and he wouldn't question it now. He walked back to his workshop, the worn leather of his boots sinking into the soft earth. He returned with the spade, its metal edge sharp and clean. The mud was heavy. It clung to the shovel with a greedy, sucking force. Each scoop was a deadweight, a shovelful of years and rot. Ghost watched from a few feet away, his body coiled with tension. He sat, a silent, muddy sentinel, his gaze locked on the growing hole. Elias worked with the steady, metronomic pace that had carried him through desert patrols and mountain deployments. He didn't rush. He was methodical. He was thorough. 20 minutes in, the shovel struck something with a dull, solid thud. It wasn't the sharp crack of rock or the hollow echo of old metal. This was different. A dense, unyielding sound. Elias's interest sharpened. He knelt, using the edge of the spade to scrape away the thick layers of muck. Slowly, a corner of dark green emerged. It wasn't metal, but a hard, textured polymer. He dug with more precision now, his hands eventually taking over, scooping away the cold mud to reveal the object's shape. It was a case. A military-style hard case, about the size of a small briefcase, with heavy-duty latches on the front and a pressure release valve. It was caked in a half-inch of petrified grime, but he could see it was designed to be waterproof, airtight, indestructible. With a final grunt of effort, he broke the suction of the mud and lifted it from its grave. It was heavy, weighted with more than just its own construction. He carried it up the bank and set it on the dry grass. Ghost approached, sniffing the case from every angle before finally sitting, his duty done. He looked up at Elias, panting softly as if to say, "There. Now you see." Back in the quiet of his workshop, surrounded by the familiar smells of oil and sawdust, Elias placed the case on his workbench. The latches were stiff, seized by decades of subterranean pressure. He had to use a pry bar, the plastic groaning in protest before finally giving way with a loud crack. He lifted the lid. The seal had held. The inside was perfectly dry, the foam lining intact, though yellowed with age. Nestled within was a single object wrapped in oilcloth. His hands, steady as they'd ever been, carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a standard issue dog tag on a tarnished silver chain, a small faded photograph of a smiling young woman holding a baby, and a thick, folded letter, sealed in a Ziploc bag that had become brittle with time. He picked up the dog tag. The name stamped into the metal was faint but legible. Vance, Michael R., U.S. Army. Elias froze. He knew that name. Everyone in town knew that name. Sergeant Michael Vance was a local legend, the boy who'd gone to Vietnam and never come home. His name was carved into the granite of the town's war memorial, a name listed as missing in action. Presumed dead for 40 years. With a reverence he hadn't felt in a long time, Elias carefully worked open the plastic bag. The paper inside was crisp. He unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat, the blue ink still vibrant. It was dated April 1972. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began. Elias stopped reading. This wasn't for him. This was a dead man's final dispatch, a message in a bottle that had waited 4 decades to wash ashore. The weight of the case in his hands was gone, replaced by the far heavier weight of a promise he now had to keep. He had to find Sarah. His mission began the next morning at the county courthouse, a stuffy building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. The clerk, a woman with a mountain of white hair and skeptical eyes, looked at him over her glasses. Elias didn't look like most of the locals. He was quiet, and his stillness had an edge to it that people found unsettling. "Vance," he said, his voice even, "looking for records on the family of Michael Vance." The clerk's demeanor softened. "Oh, poor Michael. Such a tragedy. His mother passed 20 years ago. Heartbreak, they said." She told him Michael had a wife, Mary, who had raised their daughter alone. Mary had passed away from cancer about a decade back. The daughter's name was Sarah, just like the letter. "Sarah moved away after her mother died," the clerk continued, her voice dropping. "Sold the old house. I think she went to Raleigh. Or was it Charlotte? Hard to keep track. It was a cold trail, but it was a start." Elias spent the next 2 days at the local library scrolling through microfilm of old newspapers, searching for an obituary for Mary Vance. He found it in an edition from 12 years prior. It listed her surviving daughter, Sarah Connolly of Raleigh. A new name, a city. The trail was getting warmer. Ghost sat patiently in the back of his truck outside, watching the library doors, waiting. Finding Sarah Connolly in a city of 500,000 people was the next hurdle. Elias was not a private detective, but he was a Marine. He knew how to gather intelligence. He used online databases, public records. He made a few quiet, deliberate phone calls. He moved with a singular purpose, fueled by the letter that now sat on his passenger seat, a sacred trust he refused to break. After a week of dead ends, he found her. A property record. A simple 3-bedroom house in a quiet Raleigh suburb. The drive was 3 hours. Ghost rode shotgun, his head resting on the center console, his eyes occasionally flicking to Elias's face. The man and dog were a self-contained unit, moving through the world with a shared, unspoken understanding. The house was modest, well-kept, with a garden of late-season flowers in the front yard. A woman was on her knees, tending to the plants, her back to the street. She had dark hair, streaked with a little gray. As Elias pulled to the curb and cut the engine, she looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. Elias got out of the truck, leaving Ghost to wait. He moved without hurry, his boots making a soft crunch on the gravel shoulder. The woman stood, wiping dirt from her hands onto her jeans. She watched him approach, a question in her eyes. She was in her early 40s, with a kind but tired face. "Ma'am," Elias said, stopping at the edge of her lawn. "Are you Sarah Connolly?" "I am," she said, her voice cautious. "Can I help you?" "My name is Elias Thorne. I found something. On my property. I believe it belonged to your father, Sergeant Michael Vance." Sarah's expression changed. The name hung in the air between them, a ghost from a past she had learned to live with. Decades of practiced composure settled over her features, but he saw the flicker of pain in her eyes. "My father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What could you possibly have found?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He walked back to his truck and returned with the green case. He held it out to her. She stared at it, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to take it. It was heavier than she expected. "I found it buried at the bottom of an old pond," Elias explained quietly. "It was sealed." She fumbled with the latches, her fingers clumsy with a sudden rush of emotion. She opened it. She saw the photograph first, a picture of her own mother, young and vibrant, holding her as a baby. A soft gasp escaped her lips. Then, she saw the dog tag. And finally, the letter. She took it out, her hands shaking so much she could barely unfold the paper. She stood there, in the sunlight of her quiet suburban yard, and began to read the last words her father ever wrote. Elias stood at a respectful distance, turning his back to give her a measure of privacy. He heard a soft sob, then another. He looked over at his truck. Ghost was sitting up, his head cocked, watching the scene with an intense, knowing gaze. After a long time, Sarah spoke. "He was alive," she said, her voice choked with tears. She turned to face Elias, the letter clutched in her hand. "The date on this, it's 2 weeks after the army said his unit was lost. He was still alive out there. He was trying to get home." She looked down at the letter again, her tears staining the 40-year-old paper. "He talks about me. He said he couldn't wait to see me walk. He said my name." Elias just nodded. There was nothing to say. Words were useless against a grief so old. "All my life," she said, looking up at him, her eyes filled with a lifetime of unanswered questions. "I've wondered if he ever thought of me, if he even knew what I looked like. This picture, it was the one my mother sent him a month before he disappeared." She held out the letter. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea what this means. You've given him back to me. It wasn't me, Elias said, his gaze drifting to the truck. My dog found it. They stood in silence for another moment, the chasm of 40 years bridged by a piece of paper and a rusted dog tag. Elias finally gave a slight nod, a gesture of farewell, and walked back to his truck. He didn't need thanks. He hadn't done it for that. He'd done it because it was the right thing to do. A duty owed from one soldier to another. The drive home was quiet. The sun was setting, painting the Carolina sky in strokes of orange and purple. When they got back to the property, the air was clean and crisp. The smell of the pond was gone, replaced by the scent of pine and damp earth. The empty basin was a clean slate, a wound in the earth that could now begin to heal. Too. Elias sat on the porch steps of the old farmhouse, a bottle of beer in his hand. Ghost came and sat beside him, leaning his heavy body against Elias's leg. He rested his head on the man's knee, letting out a contented sigh. Elias placed a hand on the dog's broad head, his fingers scratching behind the familiar warmth of his ears. He looked out at the dark shape of the empty pond, a place that had given up its long-held secret. He had come here for solitude, to outrun the ghosts of his own past. But today, on this quiet piece of land, he had helped lay another man's ghost to rest. The mission was complete. The silence that settled over the farm wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful. And in the fading light, the bond between the quiet Marine and his faithful dog was the only thing that mattered.